When I was in college, we had a pretty rigorous schedule. We had to wake up early for classes, and we had a lot of studying to do, so sleeping in was a rare treat. One day my roommate woke up after a particularly long nap and said, "Wow, what a dream. I just spent 3 hours with Nikola Tesla, and he showed me how to harness the power of the universe." I smiled politely and went back to my calculus homework. Of course, he was joking, but I thought it was pretty funny that his subconscious mind would conjure up an image of Nikola Tesla, one of the most famous inventors of all time. But at that time, only a handful of people knew who Nikola Tesla was. And today, thanks to the popular culture and the internet, everyone knows about him. In fact, he's kind of like a household name now. So what happened? Why is everyone suddenly talking about this guy who died 80 years ago? Well, when you look at the history of electricity and the contributions that various scientists made to it, the answer becomes clear. Like Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla was a great inventor, but he also attracted a lot of attention from the media. They loved his eccentric behavior and dramatic public appearances. And even though he died before the modern age of advertising, his image has been used over and over again by companies to sell everything from coffee to board games to fire extinguishers. However, there are some interesting stories from his life that have nothing to do with electricity. So let's explore them through this sleepy story. Welcome to my channel. It's time to wind down and get ready for bed. As you know, I love telling stories about forgotten figures from history. And sometimes these people are forgotten because their accomplishments weren't that important. But other times they were famous in their day, but they got lost in the shuffle as the years went on. I do like to think of this show as sort of a history time capsule that lets us learn about important figures from the past who deserve another chance. However, every once in a while, I stumble across a person whose life was so bizarre that they should be remembered not just for what they did, but also for who they were. This week's episode is one such story. So join me if you'd like to hear sleepy stories from the Silent Ages, a biography of forgotten figures. Our subject this week is the strange case of John Henry Pepper, an African-American man, who was born in New York City in 1931. Pepper grew up in poverty and became interested in the circus arts at a young age. When he was still a teenager, he ran away from home to join a traveling carnival. There he learned how to perform many daring feats, including tightrope walking, juggling, and lion wrestling. As he got older, his act became more daring, and he was soon known as the Daring Black Wonder. He traveled all over the world, performing in circuses and carnivals, and he was eventually billed as one of the greatest daredevils of all time. Some of his most famous stunts included riding a unicycle on a tightrope, crossing Niagara Falls on a wire, and swimming with sharks. In 1964, Pepper was hired to perform a stunt in the James Bond film Goldfinger. His job was to walk across a narrow ledge on the side of a building while the camera crew filmed him from the ground below. Unfortunately, as he began his performance, a strong gust of wind knocked him off balance, and he fell to his death. Even though his life was cut short, he left behind a legacy of amazing stunts and a reputation as one of the greatest daredevils of all time. I stumbled across the story of John Henry Pepper while researching the silent film era. His death was actually one of the first big news stories I ever read. And as a kid, I thought he was an amazing person. What could be more exciting than riding a motorcycle on a tightrope or swimming with lions? And even though he died before I was born, I wanted to learn everything I could about him. That's when I discovered his story wasn't nearly as thrilling as the headlines had made out. For example, when he crossed Niagara Falls, he didn't do it on a wire like those other guys who were famous at the time. Instead, he walked across the falls in a barrel. Also, he never really wrestled lions. He just stood next to them while they roared in cages. That doesn't mean the guy wasn't brave or talented, but I think he might have embellished his stories a bit to attract more attention. Still, his life was definitely exciting enough, and there's no doubt that he was a skilled performer. That's why I decided to make a sleepy story about him. You see, I like to tell stories about people who are known for being boring, but they're also fun to talk about. I can imagine sitting down with a glass of milk and cookies and telling this story to a bunch of kids. Plus, John Henry Pepper died before the days of the internet, so there aren't any photos of him online. That means I can use my imagination and draw him however I want. However, there is one part of his story that I think is very interesting. He was born in New York City, which is the birthplace of jazz music. Jazz is known for its improvisational nature and complex harmonies. It's a style of music that relies heavily on the performer's ability to work together as a team and respond to each other as cues. This requires a high level of skill and musicianship, but the results can be truly amazing. Some of the greatest jazz musicians of all time include Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Miles Davis. They all lived during the silent film era, but their music was a big influence on me. When I was growing up, as I got older, I started listening to more contemporary artists like Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and Wayne Shorter. These guys were born after the end of the silent film era, but they continued the tradition of improvisation and musical exploration that the pioneers of jazz had started so many years ago. I think there's a lot of similarities between the way jazz musicians play and the way filmmakers edit their movies. Both art forms rely on the performer's ability to tell a story without words. They also both require a lot of planning ahead of time, but also allow for spontaneity in the moment. That's why I often find myself listening to jazz music when I'm working on a project or trying to come up with new ideas. It's a great way to get inspired and feel energized. So if you're ever feeling bored or stuck in a rut, I encourage you to put on some jazz music and see where your mind goes. Who knows, you might just surprise yourself with what you come up with. It's that time again. Thank you all for watching this episode of Sleepy Stories. If you enjoyed the content, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. Remember, dreams don't work unless you work them. Good night and sleep tight.